There's a moment right before the breakthrough, right before the blessing, where everything in you wants to quit. That's the moment the enemy loves to attack because he knows something you don't. You are closer than you think. You've been praying, you've been believing, and you've been fighting, but maybe you're starting to wonder, is it even worth it? You've given it everything you've got, and the door still hasn't opened. The healing still hasn't come. The promise still feels far away. But just because you don't see movement doesn't mean God isn't working. You don't plant a seed and expect it to sprout overnight. It stays buried in the dirt, hidden from sight, but under the surface, something is shifting. Roots are taking hold. Strength is being built. And in the right season, that seed breaks through. The same God who started the good work in you will be faithful to complete it. You're closer than you think. The enemy knows it, and that's why the pressure is increasing. That's why the opposition feels stronger. But don't let the attack make you abandon what God has anointed. The storm isn't proof that you're failing. It's proof that you're on the verge of something great. This is not the time to shrink back. It's not the time to let doubt take over. It's the time to press forward. Keep praying, keep trusting, keep standing, because the breakthrough is closer than you think. There's something about the moment right before the breakthrough that feels the hardest. It's the place where doubt creeps in, exhaustion settles deep, and every part of you wants to turn back. You start to wonder if you misheard God, if you took the wrong path, if all your effort has been wasted. But what if the resistance you're feeling isn't a sign to quit, but a sign that you're right on the edge of what God has for you? The enemy knows he can't stop God's plan for your life, but if he can get you to give up before you see it, he doesn't have to. That's why the battle intensifies just before the breakthrough. The pressure gets heavier, the distractions get louder, and the temptation to walk away becomes stronger, but that's also why you have to stand firm. The enemy isn't fighting you because you're weak. He's fighting you because you're a threat. Think about the story of the Israelites at the walls of Jericho. God told them to march around the city for 6 days, and on the 7th day, they had to march 7 times before they saw the walls fall. Now imagine if they had stopped on the 6th day. Imagine if they had gotten tired, discouraged, or convinced themselves it wasn't working. The promise was already in motion, but if they had given up too soon, they would have never seen it come to pass. The same is true for you. You might be on your 6th lap around the wall right now, and it feels like nothing is changing. You're praying, you're believing, and you're doing everything you know to do, but the situation still looks the same. That's where faith is tested. That's where endurance is built. That's where you have to decide that you will keep walking, keep trusting, and keep standing, because what God promised is still on the way. The struggle isn't proof that you're failing, it's proof that you're close. Sometimes the battle feels the hardest right before the blessing, because that's when your faith is being refined. It's when your character is being shaped. God doesn't just want to give you a breakthrough. He wants to prepare you for it. He wants you to be ready to handle what He's bringing into your life. David was anointed to be king, but before he sat on the throne, he had to fight giants, run from Saul, and navigate years of uncertainty. The battle wasn't a sign that God had abandoned him. It was a sign that he was being positioned for something greater. The same is happening in your life. The challenges you're facing are not there to break you. They are there to build you. So don't be discouraged by the resistance. If anything, let it remind you that you're getting closer. The enemy wouldn't be fighting you this hard if you weren't about to step into something significant. Keep pressing forward, keep standing in faith, and don't let the battle make you forget the promise. You are closer than you think. Just because you don't see anything happening doesn't mean God isn't working. That's one of the hardest truths to hold on to when you're in a season of waiting, uncertainty, or struggle. You've prayed the prayers, you've sown the seeds, you've believed for the breakthrough, but everything around you still looks the same. And in that space, doubt starts whispering, maybe God isn't doing anything, maybe He's forgotten, maybe this is as far as you'll get. But faith isn't about what you see. It's about what you trust. And God is always working, even in the silence. Think about how seeds grow. When a farmer plants a seed, he doesn't expect to see results the next morning. He knows that before anything breaks through the surface, there's a process happening underground. The roots are taking hold, the foundation is being built, and the seed is preparing for what's next. If the farmer judged the progress only by what he could see, he might assume nothing was happening at all. But he understands that growth doesn't start in the visible, it starts in the unseen. The same is true in your life. Just because you can't see God moving doesn't mean he isn't setting things into motion. Joseph spent years in prison after being falsely accused. From the outside, it looked like nothing was happening. It seemed like his dreams had died, like his purpose had been forgotten. But what Joseph didn't realize was that while he was waiting, God was working behind the scenes. He was orchestrating events, shifting circumstances, and positioning Joseph for something greater than he could have imagined. When the time was right, Joseph went from the prison to the palace in a single day. The delay wasn't denial, it was preparation. There are things God is working on in your life that you can't see right now. Maybe he's opening doors that haven't come into view yet. Maybe he's working on someone's heart to bring reconciliation. Maybe he's setting things in motion that will align at the right time. But if you let frustration take over, you might walk away from something that was already in progress. Faith isn't about seeing results instantly. It's about trusting that God is doing something even when you don't see it. When the Israelites were fleeing Egypt, they came to the Red Sea and it looked like there was no way forward. But what they didn't know was that God had already planned their escape. Before they even reached the sea, God had a strategy in place to part the waters. It was already done in his plan. It just hadn't been revealed to them yet. The same is true for you. God has already gone before you. He has already made a way where there seems to be no way. He is already working things out for your good. But if you base your belief on what you see, you'll lose sight of what he's spoken. His promises don't change just because your circumstances feel stagnant. His timing doesn't shift just because you're growing impatient. Sometimes God allows delays because he's working on something bigger than you can see. Maybe he's protecting you from a situation you're not ready for. Maybe he's refining your character so that when the breakthrough comes, you'll be prepared to handle it. Sometimes the waiting is just as important as the blessing, because it's in the waiting that your faith is strengthened. If you could see everything God was doing behind the scenes, you wouldn't doubt for a second. But faith means trusting him even when you don't have the full picture. It means believing that he is moving even when you feel stuck. It means holding on to his promises even when it seems like nothing is changing, because he is faithful, he is working. And just because you don't see it yet doesn't mean it's not already in motion. The moment you step into your calling, the moment you start moving toward what God has for you, opposition will come. The enemy doesn't fight people who aren't a threat. He doesn't waste his energy attacking something that isn't powerful. So when you feel like everything is coming against you, when you feel the weight of resistance pressing in, it's not a sign that you're on the wrong path. It's a sign that you're on the verge of something great. Too often, we mistake resistance for rejection. We assume that if something is hard, if doors aren't opening easily, or if we face battles along the way, then maybe we heard God wrong. But think about Jesus right before he stepped into his ministry. He was led into the wilderness for 40 days of testing. Right before he went to the cross to accomplish the greatest victory in history, he was betrayed, beaten, and abandoned. The pattern is clear. Great opposition comes before great breakthrough. David experienced this too. Before he ever became king, he had to face a giant named Goliath. But notice something: Goliath didn't show up when David was tending sheep. The battle came when David stepped onto the battlefield, ready to step into his purpose. The enemy didn't see David as a threat when he was in the field, but the moment he started walking in his anointing, the attack came. And the same is true in your life. The closer you get to stepping into what God has for you, the more the enemy will try to stop you. Resistance is not a stop signal, it's confirmation that you're moving in the right direction. If the enemy is trying to take you out, it's because he knows God is about to raise you up. He wouldn't be attacking your family, your finances, your peace, or your confidence if there wasn't something valuable inside of you. And the mistake we make is thinking that hardship means we should turn back, when in reality, it's the reason we should keep pushing forward. Look at the story of Nehemiah. God put it on his heart to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, and the moment he started the work, opposition came. His enemies mocked him, threatened him, and tried to intimidate him into quitting, but Nehemiah didn't let their words stop him. He kept building. He kept moving forward. He refused to be distracted by the opposition, and because of that, the wall was completed. What if Nehemiah had given up? What if he had allowed the attacks to convince him that it wasn't worth it? The enemy wants to make you quit before you see the promise fulfilled. He wants to wear you down, discourage you, and make you believe that the resistance means you should walk away. But what if the struggle isn't there to stop you, it's there to strengthen you? God never promised an easy road, but He did promise that He would be with you in the fight. The battle may feel intense, but you are not in it alone. The resistance may be strong, but the power inside of you is stronger. And sometimes the very thing that seems like it's trying to break you is actually the thing God is using to build you. Think about the process of refining gold. The gold has to go through intense heat to remove impurities. The fire isn't there to destroy it, it's there to purify it. And maybe that's what God is doing in your life right now. Maybe the resistance you're facing is refining you, strengthening you, and preparing you for what's next. If the enemy is attacking, take it as a sign that something significant is on the horizon. The pressure isn't there because you're failing. It's there because you're getting closer. So don't back down. Don't retreat. Keep building. Keep believing. Keep pushing forward, because the breakthrough you've been praying for is closer than you think. Waiting is one of the hardest things to do, especially when you know God has given you a promise. You've prayed, you've prepared, and you've positioned yourself in faith, but nothing seems to be happening. The temptation is to assume that God has forgotten, that maybe He changed His mind, or that you missed your opportunity. But what if the waiting isn't wasted? What if God is using this season to shape you for what He has already set aside for you? One of the greatest tests of faith is how you handle the in-between, the space between the promise and the fulfillment. Anybody can praise God when the breakthrough comes, but can you trust Him when there's no evidence of progress? Can you keep showing up when you don't see results? Can you stay faithful when it feels like nothing is changing? Because it's in the waiting that God prepares you for what He has already planned. Think about David. He was anointed as king when he was still a shepherd boy, but he didn't step into that position immediately. Instead, he spent years serving, running, and fighting battles that seemed unrelated to his calling, but those years weren't wasted. Every fight he faced, every challenge he endured was shaping him into the leader he needed to be. If David had skipped the waiting season, he wouldn't have been ready for the throne. The same is true for you. God isn't just interested in giving you the blessing. He wants to make sure you're ready to handle it. And that means there are things He needs to work out in you before He works things out around you. Maybe He's building your patience, strengthening your character, or teaching you how to trust Him more deeply. If you rush the process, you might receive the blessing before you're prepared to sustain it. Look at the Israelites. When God delivered them from Egypt, He could have taken them on a direct route to the promised land, but instead He led them the long way through the wilderness, not because He was punishing them, but because they weren't ready for what was ahead. They needed time to grow, to trust, and to let go of the mindset of slavery before they could step into the freedom God had for them. If they had arrived too soon, they wouldn't have been able to handle the promise. Sometimes the waiting season is God's protection. You might think you're ready for what you've been praying for, but God sees what you can't. He knows the challenges ahead, the responsibilities that come with the blessing, and the lessons you need to learn first. If He gave it to you too soon, it could crush you instead of bless you. So instead of seeing the waiting as a delay, start seeing it as preparation. What you do in the waiting matters. How you steward this season determines how you step into the next one. If you spend the waiting complaining, doubting, or trying to force things to happen on your own, you might miss what God is trying to teach you. But if you embrace it with faith, trusting that He is working even when you don't see it, you'll come out stronger, wiser, and ready for what's ahead. Joseph spent years in a prison cell before he was elevated to the palace. From the outside, it looked like he was stuck, forgotten, and far from the dream God had given him. But in reality, he was exactly where he needed to be. The skills he learned, the humility he developed, and the trust he built in God during that time were what prepared him for the position of power he would later step into. You may feel like you're in a holding pattern, but God doesn't waste seasons. He doesn't waste pain, delays, or even disappointments. Every moment is shaping you, preparing you, and getting you ready for what's next. The way you handle this season is setting the foundation for the next one. Will you trust God enough to be faithful where you are, even when you don't see where it's leading? Will you choose to believe that His timing is better than yours? God's promises are sure. His plan is still in motion. And when the time is right, He will open the door. But right now, in this moment, how you wait is just as important as what you're waiting for. So stay faithful, keep trusting, keep preparing, because when the promise comes, you'll be ready. The enemy would love for you to believe that you're far away from what God has promised you. He wants you to think that the breakthrough is still out of reach, that the dream is too big, and that you're wasting your time believing for something that may never happen. But what if the very thing you've been praying for, believing for, and waiting for is closer than you think? So many people give up right at the edge of their breakthrough. They walk away because they don't see the progress, they don't feel the momentum, and they assume nothing is happening. But what if they had just kept going for one more day? What if they had prayed one more prayer, taken one more step, or trusted God for just a little longer? When the Israelites were marching around Jericho, God told them to circle the city for 7 days. Nothing happened on day 1. Nothing happened on day 2. Nothing happened on day 3. But on the 7th day, when they followed God's instructions one last time, the walls came crashing down. What if they had stopped on day 6? What if they had given up because they didn't see the progress? The breakthrough was already set in motion, but they had to keep moving to see it come to pass. That's where so many people miss it. They assume that if they don't see immediate results, it must not be working. But just because you can't see movement doesn't mean God isn't moving. Sometimes the greatest shifts happen in the unseen before they are revealed in the natural. What you've been waiting for may already be on its way, but you have to keep going to reach it. Think about a runner in a marathon. The final stretch is the hardest part. Their legs feel heavy, their breath is short, and their body is screaming for them to stop. But just beyond the pain, just past the exhaustion, is the finish line. The enemy wants you to quit right before you get there. He wants to convince you that the struggle means failure, when in reality, it means you're closer than ever. Look at the story of Elijah. After years of drought, he prayed for rain. He sent his servant to look for a sign, and 6 times there was nothing. No clouds, no change, no indication that anything was happening. But Elijah didn't stop praying. He didn't stop believing. And on the 7th time, the servant saw a small cloud rising in the distance. It wasn't a downpour yet, but it was the sign that the rain was coming. Maybe you've been praying, but you haven't seen the answer. Maybe you've been believing, but nothing seems different. Maybe you've been walking in obedience, but the doors haven't opened yet. What if the next prayer, the next step, the next act of faith is the one that unlocks what God has been preparing for you? The enemy knows he can't stop what God has promised, but he will do everything he can to stop you from getting there. That's why the pressure intensifies when you're close. That's why doubt increases, why the attacks feel stronger, and why you start questioning everything. The closer you get, the harder the enemy fights, because he knows that if you keep going, you will step into what God has for you. Look at Peter when he walked on water. As long as he kept his eyes on Jesus, he was walking in the miraculous. But the moment he looked at the waves, the moment he focused on the storm instead of the Savior, he started to sink. The storm didn't change, his focus did. The enemy wants to distract you with the waves. He wants you to look at the obstacles, the delays, and the difficulties so that you forget how close you really are. But what if you chose to keep your eyes on God? What if you decided to trust that He is leading you even when the path isn't clear? What if you refuse to let fear, discouragement, or doubt make you turn back? You've come too far to quit now. You've fought too many battles, prayed too many prayers, and endured too much to stop before the finish line. God has not brought you this far to leave you. The promise is still ahead. The breakthrough is still coming, and you are closer than you think. So keep going, keep believing, keep pressing forward, because what God has for you is closer than you know.